Okay, I'm going to give you the brief introduction to our presenter, Blake McGowan. Blake is a certified professional ergonomist at the Human Tech, and he is a member of the ACGIH, AIHA, and the HFES, a lot of professional association. He is also the past officer for the AIHA Ergonomics Committee at the Human Tech. Blake oversees a large-scale ergonomic initiatives that help organizations build internal ergonomic solutions and using the software methods. He leads the Ergonomic Research Group at Human Tech to incorporate the latest technologies into the Human Tech software solutions. And he also consults with NIOSH and university and a lot of people from different organizations to advance their ergonomics services. And I've been to many presentations by Blake at national and international conferences, and I always learn a lot of great deal about his new insights. And I thought it's a great opportunity to bring him to NIOSH. So today, we actually have a live audience at the Taft Laboratory in Cincinnati, Ohio. And right now it's -degrees, super cold, and hopefully you have a warm room in your own room listening to these webinars. And without further ado, we welcome Blake for his presentation.
Thanks, Jack. I appreciate the introduction and honored to be here in Cincinnati at the NIOSH facility to share some information about how to communicate the value of ergonomics to stakeholders. And what I mean by stakeholders is business stakeholders. And just as a little preview for the presentation for those of you online, I'm going to share a little bit of information on how to communicate the value of ergonomics for an initiative as well as a ergonomic intervention. But I hope we can kind of wrap up my portion of the presentation in about half an hour and create a good discussion. As Jack had mentioned, I've given this presentation a few times at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society conferences, as well as the International Ergonomics Association conference. And we continue to build on this information to kind of provide some support for people in industry as well as practitioners of, how can we advance what we're trying to accomplish. And so I'd like to kind of introduce our approach, our story of how to communicate the value of ergonomics to stakeholders. All right, so just at a very high level, things that we'd like to kind of cover today are listed out here. I think it's always great to start off with a reminder of what ergonomics truly is. And I think there is some differences in definitions across the globe. I have a preference for one definition over another, and I think sometimes we undersell our value, and I'd like to cover that first. Kind of list out, giving you a preview of who I feel or what research tells us who are all the benefactors of having a good ergonomic initiative. And I think there's a lot more than just the health and safety professional. And then follow that up with what are the actual benefits that each of those benefactors receive and support that with data. And really to kick off that discussion, the third bullet point, we're talking about what are really the true social as well as financial, costs of having poor ergonomics. And for most of us, we understand those are musculoskeletal disorders or MSDs. And then going through some of those benefactors, what can they really get from ergonomics? And again, I hope there's a lot of questions and discussions and your feedback. Please feel to type questions during the presentation, and we'll ask those or answer those at the end. So I think this is a point that, as ergonomists, that we sometimes overlook. And I think it's valuable to go back and remind ourselves really what is ergonomics. And this kind of topic prompted my deeper thought about it when I was over at the IEA conference and really talking about what is the value of ergonomics there. And I think we need to extend our definition beyond just MSDs to making sure we know that it actually optimizes human performance. And what we'll see here next on the screen are the actual definitions pulled from a couple of ergonomic-related, research-related websites, one being the International Ergonomics Association as well as the HFES website. And not to go through and read it all, but the underlined areas I think are really important for us to remember. It's about optimizing human well-being and overall system performance. And I think sometimes when we start to look at, going back, we're really trying to optimize the performance of that person, making sure they perform things as best as possible, maybe even thinking of ourselves as carbon-based machines that come with instructions and capabilities, and go beyond what sometimes we only focus on here in North America. And here's the definition from CDC as well as NIOSH. You know, there's that real big focus on ergonomics being about reducing soft tissue injuries and, you know, maybe the de-emphasis of optimizing performance of people. And that's not just contained to the U.S. When we look at the same definition on the OCCURRENCE website in Canada, they say ergonomics is all about reducing risk from ergonomic hazards in the workplace. So what I want to share today is information to kind of take us beyond just focusing on MSD risks, but also understanding that those are a primary driver for why we do what we do. There are huge social as well as financial costs to musculoskeletal disorders, and we need to understand those. And we also need to understand that that may not drive all practitioners or businesses to act. There's really compelling data here that I want to share, but it's not the only data that we can use moving forward. So just at a high level, I'd like to kind of summarize who benefits from good ergonomics and what are some of the values, and then start to get into the details, and hopefully those details will prompt some questions. This might be a little bit of an overwhelming graphic to look at first, but what we're trying to convey here visually is, you know, who are those benefactors and what are those benefits? At that top row, we have a series of graphics of people. In the bottom row are kind of the benefits that those individuals receive. So starting in the top left-hand corner, the person with the yellow bump cap, you know, that is our employee. Obviously, they benefit from having good ergonomics, reduced discomfort, improved comfort, improved performance. Moving to the right, it might be an individual who's in HR, maybe even someone who is part of, you know, just the admin side of your facility. And there are some benefits that they receive with regards to turnover as well as absenteeism. Moving further to the right, we see an individual that might be associated with health and safety, maybe even ergonomics. And their benefits may include things like reductions in risk, reductions in injuries, reductions in costs associated with injuries. Moving further to the right, we have production. And we see there's a lot of connection between good ergonomics as well as good production, especially with things like lean manufacturing. We know that wasted motion, ergonomic risk factors are associated with wasted motion in many cases, and there's ways that we can identify and quantify those impacts. Moving further to the right, quality. Personally, I feel the biggest benefit of good ergonomics is improved quality. And a lot of data has been published in the last decade or so showing that there's massive benefits to quality based on good ergonomics. So there's all types of things like improved quality, reduction in defects, reduction in cost to actually correct those quality issues. And then moving further to the right, there's a lot of data showing that people such as ESG, environmental social governance individuals, corporate finance people, and C-suite leadership all benefit from good ergonomics because ergonomics improves human capital as well as management systems for safety. And so there's a big benefit there to individuals in the leadership side or the financial side. Good safety equals good performance in business. Okay. So there's benefits that we traditionally think of, kind of those employee well-being benefits that may rest in the departments of safety or HR. And what I want to lay out today is the benefits even that go beyond that. Maybe business benefits such as increases in profit, increases in sustainability, quality, as well as productivity. Now let's maybe step back a little bit to maybe update the information that's available to practitioners and people in business of what are the true social as well as financial costs to soft tissue injuries, specifically musculoskeletal disorders. And there's been a lot of great data being published over the last few decades, and we're going to start maybe at the highest level. We start to see this graphic presented a lot at ergonomic conferences, especially internationally, talking about the global burden of diseases. Where do MSDs and other type of soft tissue injuries fall within all the other types of diseases that humans experience? When you take a look at this graphic, it's kind of messy, it's kind of detailed, but at the top of the list, it basically says that heart disease is the #1 global burden of disease, followed by respiratory issues, cerebral vascular issues, and HIV is number 5. And then when you go down the list, number 6 is low back pain. Well, one of the things I've never seen is a run or walk for low back pain. I've seen runs and walks for HIV or heart disease or breast cancer, but sometimes we don't really realize how big of an issue soft tissue injuries as well as low back pain are from a global burden of disease standpoint. As we go further down that list, still in the top 25, we have neck pain, as well as other MSDs. So MSDs make up 3 of the top 25 global burdens of disease. And if we just want to represent that in a little different format, since 1999 through 2010, over a kind of a 20-year period, we see from left to right on our screen in the graphic, the #1 through number 25 global burden of disease, and things like low back pain at number 6 and neck pain and other MSDs are increasing over time. This may be due to the fact that we're actually proactively and absolutely reducing risk in other areas, and therefore these ratios are actually increasing for the soft tissue injuries. But in some ways, we're not really having any impact at all. And this was a great slide that I saw from Bill Maris, talking about the years lived with disability. And low back pain was the #1 cause in 1990, 2005, and 2015. And his short summary of this was, based on all the effort that we've been doing, all the research, we really haven't had a lot of impact. And either we need to focus on this a little bit more, or maybe change the way that we actually start to measure how we're affecting these types of diseases. So low back pain, MSDs, are absolutely a global burden of disease that affects people and many of their years lived. This is important stuff. Now, when we start to look at the occurrence of MSDs globally, and there's data for all different types of parts of the world, but 3 that I chose were the United States, Canada, as well as Europe, kind of anywhere between 30% and 50% of all injuries are MSD related. I mean, this is a definitely a very high number and warrants our attention. And we start to look at the costs associated with these. These are kind of the direct costs of MSDs in the United States on an annual basis is about $500 billion. We start to incorporate the indirect costs, it rises to about $339 billion more, and it just keeps elevating. Now, when we start to look at individual types of MSDs, we see that the upper extremity disorders have a lot of costs associated with them. Maybe on average, it's about $30,000 in direct costs to kind of address an upper extremity issue. That may be carpal tunnel syndrome. It may be an upper extremity or shoulder issue. Now, when we look at low back pain, maybe on average it's about $50,000 to address that issue. These are significant dollars, and what we're showing here are only the direct costs. Now, when we look at, what are the leading causes of these types of workplace injuries, I refer to the great data set from Liberty Mutual, the Workplace Safety Index. The leading cause of those non-fatal occupational injuries are material handling. The lifting, the lowering, the pushing, pulling, carrying, throwing, those types of activities are the driver of these MSDs. And so if we look at the details from the 2017 Liberty Mutual Workplace Safety Index, we can see about a quarter of all non-fatal occupational injuries are related to these overexertions, these pushing, pulling, carrying, those types of activities. Looking further across the graphic all the way to the right, repetitive motions are not as big of a concern as they used to be. About 3% of all those workplace issues are related to repetitive motion. The majority are due to forceful exertions. Now, unfortunately, if you start to do a little analysis of that data, the percentage of non-fatal occupational injuries that are related to push, pull, lift, lower really hasn't changed over the last decade or 2 decades. It is pretty consistent, which probably tells us that we haven't found the cause or we're not doing the right things. I think it's a little bit of both. I think there are some really good approaches out there that we've shown that have reductions in these types of injuries, but I think there are some interventions that we continue to use that have very little impact at all. Now, the one thing that has changed with regards to these overexertion injuries are the costs. They continue to rise, and they probably will continue to rise over time. So this is not good news for us, and we need to figure out ways, how can we engage our business partners to help us address these issues in the workplace. All right, from a health and safety standpoint perspective, I think we all get it. If we design the workplace for good ergonomics, for what people can do, we see benefits. And we see those benefits across things like risk and injuries and costs. And what I wanted to do is just step you through some of the data that's available. And I think there's enough data in all of these categories. It's just telling the story. I'm not too sure if we need to gather new data or do more studies on what the benefits are. I think we've got a good foundation of that. So if we look at an individual site intervention, and this is a study done by Emil Tompa out of Ontario, and one of the nice things that I like about this study is Emil is an economist. He's not an ergonomist, he's an economist. And he's taking an economic view of ergonomics. And they went ahead and did an intervention in a small manufacturing facility in southern Ontario. And they showed some amazing benefits with very little investment. You know, things like first aid cases going down by just putting in some improvements. Long-term sickness reductions, duration of those long-time sicknesses. Reduction in modified duty cases, as well as casual absenteeism. But I think one of the most important parts of this study was the show of the return on investment. And I think this return on investment is in line with others that I've seen out there. They invested roughly $65,000, and they got more than $350,000 back in value. And most of the money they spent was on educating employees and safety team members and making simple improvements that their maintenance team could put in place. We're not talking about complicated engineering solutions. Even the simple employee-driven improvements have a return on investment. And that return on investment in general terms is basically 5x. So for every dollar that you invest, either in the people or the time or the actual intervention, we are getting at least 5 times that benefit in business performance. Now, if I were to take this type of argument over to production or to a quality department and say, I have a solution that can have a return on investment of 5x, generally speaking, that manager would say, go ahead and get started. What type of money do you need to allow us to do that? Now, my experience is when we do that in health and safety, we ask for money. I don't think we always communicate that there is this type of benefit available. Now, when we transfer from maybe just a site initiative to more of a corporate participatory initiative, and this is data from Nancy Larson from 3M, we see similar results. You know, over a 10-year period, putting in a participatory ergo process where it's mainly driven by the employees, we see all types of reductions in recordable injuries, lost time cases, compensation claims, and costs associated with that. You know, and this data is pretty solid. This is, you know, peer-reviewed data. It's not just from inside of a you know, a company. This has the highest standard of review. Data coming out of Alcoa and Yale from Linda Cantley had some really nice findings. They basically said for every ergonomic intervention that they put in place, they see approximately about a 7% reduction in risk, which can be equal to about a 5% reduction in injuries per 100 person years worked. Again, there's some meaningful data. from a health and safety and wellness standpoint. Okay. Expanding on Nancy's work, over the next 10 years of that deployment within 3M, they really focused on what they called that macro ergonomic initiative, transferring the responsibility of ergonomics from the participatory approach or the employee-driven more to having systems in place where the engineers can make decisions early on and engineering can take on the ownership of it. And we saw continued reduction in things like risk, incident rates, case rates, from the health and safety standpoint. So no matter if it's a participatory intervention or it is a macro, we are seeing those benefits to employee well-being. Follow-up. This is from Cummins. They presented this at the Applied Ergo Conference several years ago. They show with just a participatory type of initiative, they're showing massive reductions in incident rates related specifically to ergonomics. Okay? And we see these types of results within, not too many years. We're seeing almost 50% reductions in 1 to 2 years and even more reductions over time. And one of the favorite, papers for me to cite is the Goggin study out of Washington, which put together, kind of pooled all the data that was out there and kind of summarized all that information in the late 2000s. And it consistently shows that there are these well-being benefits across the full spectrum for good ergonomic interventions. But going beyond that, I thought one of the best parts that Rich did was quantify the impact of different types of interventions, really showing those interventions, those engineering controls that eliminate the exposure or reduce the level of exposure are the ones that have the biggest impact. And almost equally important, showing the ones that reduce exposure time, things like job rotation, or things that rely upon behavior such as lifting techniques, don't have as many benefits. Our real benefits come from engineering type of controls, taking advantage of those hierarchy of controls, and putting in those things that change the workplace rather than ask the person to change. So going beyond just the health and safety person, there are also benefits for human resources. And I think we completely underexploit these benefits. In business or in practice, we may be communicating with this individual to share the importance of ergonomics, but we're relying completely on data related to injury reduction, risk reduction, cost reduction. There are tangible benefits to things like turnover and absenteeism. Some general data shows that anywhere between 20 to 50% of an employee's salary is required in order to find a new person to fill that job if that turns over. And in today's labor market where the unemployment is so low and people can choose where they want to go to work and they can look at where those, how nice it is to work in certain areas, if someone chooses not to work in your area because they think it's physically demanding, you're investing a lot of money to go find that new person. And that has tangible cost to it. So good ergonomics can reduce your turnover as well as your absenteeism. And it's not absenteeism from having an injury, it's just absenteeism saying, I just don't want to be there because this is physically demanding. Maybe even more important to communicate to the human resources person is what type of impact does ergonomics have on employee engagement? And this is a survey that we sent out to our current clients at the Human Tech a few years ago of asking them, what are some of the benefits that you get from deploying a systematic ergonomics initiative? And we gave some choices, and there was also options to write in. And kind of to our surprise, our clients said that the number one benefit from deploying a systematic ergonomic initiative was employee engagement. Above risk reduction, above management involvement, it is engagement. It's a way to engage all their employees on helping them make their workplace more effective and efficient and allowing their employees to be part of the job improvement process. So I thought that was really surprising information, but meaningful, because we do know that if you have an engaged employee, they can be up to 20% more productive than just a normal employee or someone who's disengaged. So this is meaningful things that have an impact on business performance. And a few years ago, I had an opportunity to participate in the Harvard Human Capital Project through the CHSH group. And one of the participants stood up and was talking about the impact of health and safety on business and said something that I thought was pretty profound, and specifically with regards to health and safety and ergonomic. They said, the ergonomic condition of the workplace reflects stakeholders' respect for the employee. And he said, it gives the employee a clear understanding of how my boss either does or does not respect me. And I thought, wow, that's a pretty pointed statement. And in order to have people that are engaged in the workplace, they need to feel trusted and respected. And if they have a work environment that maybe doesn't meet their needs, or they don't feel that leadership or management is interested in making their work environment more comfortable for them, they're going to be disengaged. Now, if leadership and management is engaged and they respect the person, and they show that by actually providing a workplace that meets their needs, I think there's benefit to that. All right, now transitioning to operations. And I think there's some really strong data here that, at least in my experience, when I've communicated this to people in production or manufacturing in quality, they're often surprised, but they see it, and they just weren't aware of it. And there's a lot of good data, and the one that I want to share here is from Virginia Tech, from Mari Nussbaum. They did a really nice study here with Boeing, talking about the impact of adjustability on things like quality and defects in production. They showed a very strong correlation between if we can reduce MSD risk in the workplace, we can increase performance. They had some good studies that showed that if I provide more adjustability in the work environment, I can get the task done faster with less time between tasks, better quality, less defects. Now, I think one of the interesting things about this one is if you just provided a simple solution that really didn't solve the problem, it wasn't very beneficial. You actually have to go ahead and address the root cause of the problem. Just putting in kind of a low-end solution doesn't work. You have to put in a meaningful solution. Following up on the data from Emil Tampa, their study on just showing that participatory ergonomic initiative, they showed that those simple improvements had at minimum a 1% increase in productivity and a 5% increase in quality, 1% increase in quality and 5% increase in productivity. Again, if you were to share that with someone in production and say, I have an engineering solution that can do these types of things, you are very likely to get funding to do that. One of my favorite studies comes out of Scandinavia from Volvo. Ann Falk has done a series of great studies on the impact of MSD risk on the quality of your product. Had a lot of data that was being able to use for the study. And basically what she did is she put every job within the Volvo facility in one of three categories. Either a low risk category for MSD risk, a moderate risk, or a high risk. And basically, if you look at the graphic on the bottom left-hand corner, we're trying to quantify the number of quality errors per MSD risk level, and it's normalized to low risk. And basically, if the job has medium or high MSD risk, it has anywhere between 4 and 5 times the number of quality errors. I think that's pretty impactful. Now, the failure rates, if you look at the bottom center graphic, for medium and high risk MSD risk jobs, we have anywhere between 4.5 and 6.5 times the failure rates. And then the bottom right-hand graph, the cost to correct quality errors is anywhere between 6 and 8 times more expensive compared to, moderate and high risk jobs compared to low risk. So we know that we have more errors, we have more failures, and we incur more costs for jobs that are higher risk. There's more quality issues associated with higher MSD risk. I think that message needs to be communicated more to quality managers. And lastly, how should we communicate with the C-suite? There's been a lot of good data published on the impact of good health and safety management systems on stock performance, corporate credit ratings, sustainability, and it's starting to get noticed by investors. Investors are really interested in investing in green companies, in companies that show sustainability, that show transparency, and I'm hearing more and more from health and safety directors as well as VPs that their CEOs are asking them for information to share with their investor relations people, because investors who are looking to spend or invest a lot of money are interested in their injury rates and what they're doing to improve employee well-being. A lot of this data had come out of, or I guess maybe the start of this data had come out of the Harvard Human Capital Initiative, and an early study by Aaron Bernstein and Larry Bieferman has shown that human capital, which is all those skills and abilities that people bring to work, if you invest in human capital, it is material to business performance, which basically means the more that you invest in your people or support your people, the better that your company will perform from a financial standpoint. And this data has been backed up by multiple studies from economists. Okay? The study on the far left-hand side, the first one under Figure 1, is from Fabius. It's a group of economists as well as physicians, occupational physicians, who did a couple of studies showing that if I were to mythically invest $10,000 in the S&P 500 over a duration of 12 or 13 years and compare that to mythically investing $10,000 into companies who have received awards for being really good at safety and safety culture. And they found that if I would have invested $10,000 in the S&P 500 between 1999 and 2012, I would have lost $76. If I would have invested $10,000 in the 29 companies that had received safety culture awards, I would have made over $7,870. So that is material to business performance. We are showing a direct correlation between safety systems and the management of those safety systems and business performance. Now they thought, well, this may not be true. Let's try and replicate this with a different safety culture award. And then Getzel did a follow-up study with a different safety award and showed a similar difference. You know, outperforming the S&P 500. Companies that invest in safety management and safety culture outperform the S&P 500. Now, as a result of that, you're starting to see a lot more companies being open and transparent to sharing this type of information with investors. Now, in my experience, years ago, maybe in the 2000s, if I would have asked a company to share their injury and illness data with me, you get a lot of strange looks and say, no, we can't share that. And even if you try to go on a website, it might be hard to find. And so as, you know, a few years ago in 2011, data from the S&P 500 shows that only maybe 20% of companies were willing to share that type of information on, you know, the employee well-being information. Now, over time, as data is showing that this sustainability or human sustainability information is important to business performance, investors are starting to ask for it, and companies are more willing to show it, and they're a lot more willing to be transparent. So in 2017, 85% of companies are willing to share this information because they know it's related to business performance. And the last study I'll show, and this is kind of an extension of the S&P 500 Research Intelligence Group, they looked at corporate credit ratings. And they looked at the impact of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG, factors on corporate credit ratings. And really, a corporate credit rating is the ability for a company to borrow money and get access to money. And they said that about 12%, about 4% of all of the corporate credit rating changes, and there's thousands and thousands of those that occur in a year, are impacted by social factors. And human capital management and safety management were the primary drivers of those social factors. Now, if you have a poor human capital management system or poor safety management system, it can actually reduce your corporate credit rating, and that reduction in the corporate credit rating may drop your stock price by 10 to 20%. Now, that's some good data to maybe share with your C-suite. Now, there's also evidence that if you have good human capital management as well as good safety management, it can actually increase your corporate credit rating, which in turn can actually increase your stock price by 10 to 20%. So the things that we do in our safety systems, in managing people, in ergonomics, by improving employee well-being, has an impact on business performance. Now, kind of summarize, and before we open this up for questions, I think we should maybe start to think of the graphic I showed earlier with, I started off on the top left-hand corner was the employee. Maybe as practitioners, people in industry, we may want to start our initial conversations with the C-suite or our leaders or quality or production. And maybe that's too much to ask for at this point. But at least we should start to engage them to help them understand that what we're trying to accomplish has a positive impact on what they're trying to accomplish. Let's try to bring in people from beyond just health and safety. Let's include people from human resources and production, quality, ESG, investor relations, those types of people into what we're trying to accomplish and build support, because there are meaningful and tangible benefits to all of us. And if I were to summarize all those benefits into a simple graph, and I've shared this with a couple other researchers who do work in this area, I get a lot of head nods on this. If we were to graph value on the vertical axis and influence on the horizontal axis and try to summarize the benefit of ergonomics, we do have meaningful and tangible benefit to health and safety. But we have even greater benefits to things like HR, production, operations, and the C-suite. If the things that we do in the field of ergonomics can improve our human capital management, can improve our safety management, where people are more interested in investing in our company, that shows tremendous value to the organization. So kind of just to summarize, and before we open it up to questions from the participants online, I think we have this opportunity to take ergonomics beyond just employee well-being and into operational and business performance benefits. So, thanks. Jessica, any questions?
Yes, so we've got our first question. It says, you shared a lot of great studies that can show the value of ergonomics. However, how do we get from the interventions our programs are doing to show the value of them?
Maybe repeat the last part of it, the value of it.
How do we get from the interventions our programs are doing to show the value of the intervention?
Yeah, if I understand the question, I think we have to start off with understanding some of the data that's out there. We typically start off with understanding that we have an injury, we have illnesses, we have costs associated with those, and our interventions can actually reduce those over time. But if we don't measure those types of things pre and post, it's hard to show the value. Now, going beyond just the health and safety benefits, we also need to go ahead and say, what's our production rates? What are our quality defect rates in advance of putting in that intervention, and then measuring those afterwards and showing those reductions? I hope that answered the question. Okay.
Are there any more questions online? You can maybe take one from here in the audience and wait for these folks to respond if there's any additional questions.
Excellent.
There's been a lot of excellent talk and comments there, so you may have done such a good job there aren't many questions.
Okay. All right, well, we're just waiting for the microphone to walk across the room, and then we'll...
I know the Cochrane report had said that there was conclusion that there weren't enough ergonomic intervention studies that showed value, and so I'm just wondering the timing of that, and that came out several years ago, so I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah. I think there are some studies that show both a positive impact and a negative impact. I think there's an opportunity that we just don't have to rely upon, risk reduction, injury cost reduction when we're doing an ergonomic intervention, and take our definition beyond MSD and take it into what we're trying to do here is optimize human performance. And when we do that, we get employee well-being as well as massive business performance benefits as well. And it's an opportunity for us as practitioners to start engaging with people from production as well as from quality to get that pre-data, and we put the intervention in and then measure the post-data and say, we are actually seeing reductions in defects. We are seeing increases in productivity. We are seeing increases in employee engagement. Our CEOs are giving us the thumbs up saying this is value added. We are seeing reductions in turnover. So I think we can go beyond just that one single, ergonomic related data set.
And Blake, how does Human Tech or your clients, how do you measure employee engagement? Do you have a specific instrument for that?
Yeah, I mean, it could be as simple as, are you happier or not as happy after the intervention? There are some standard ones like the Gallup polls. There are employee engagement polls and surveys that you can use and measure that over time. That's what we would suggest to our clients. A lot of times we find that our clients have their own internal employee engagement survey or process. The microphone's just walking across the room.
Okay, sorry about that. So as a follow-up to the first question, I think they were asking, are there any tools that you recommend using for showing return on investment?
I don't know if there is a tool that summarizes everything. A risk assessment, and there's many different risk assessments out there that can show a value return on investment from a risk standpoint. So for example, if you did a lifting equation, pre and post would show value. And then it's just kind of straight data. It's, hey, what was my quality rate issues? How much money were we spending on an annual basis? Now what are we spending? You can do motion time studies. You can do type of burden. What percentage of the employee is burdened? I think that's a big one we find, especially from a manufacturing standpoint. A lot of companies have a limit saying we can only burden the employee at X percentage. And prior to the intervention, maybe we were above that value. And after the intervention, we can actually go ahead and measure that we're below. We've reduced that burden.
And I think the next question kind of flows into this same thought process. This is, how can you frame your data, such as recordable rates and lost day work cases, in a way that help others who are not an ergonomist understand the impact, and how can these be used to indicate the risk of future injuries?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I think risk is the best data point to use. I'm always careful of using potential injury cost reductions. Like if I put in this intervention, I'm going to reduce X number of dollars related to injury costs. I think that's sometimes a risky approach, because you never know who is going to be doing that job. Someone may have moved from one industry to another, showed up at your doorstep and using that perfectly designed intervention, but hey, they're just at a certain, they've got enough trauma in their body already that they get injured. I like to use the production data. Hey, I can increase productivity by X, and we can show that we can reduce quality issues by X, and that's related to reduction in quality costs.
And one of our NIOSH colleagues who couldn't make it here today asked, how do NIOSH scientists communicate the value of ergonomic research that we do, or interventions that we test and then get adopted?
So is that a question for me?
Yeah.
I don't know if Jack wants to answer that question. Or maybe repeat the question then.
It says, so how do NIOSH scientists communicate the value of ergonomic research that we perform, or interventions that we test and then get adopted?
If you want to grab the mic, Jack, or
it's always hard to communicate our research finding to the society and our practitioners, and that's what we're trying to accomplish. One of the things, like mentioned, maybe we start going to the C-suite conferences instead of occupational safety and health conferences. It has a so much larger impact than the safety conferences. So that's one of the things we might want to consider seriously. I don't know if Blake have other comment on that.
Absolutely. One of the highlights from IEA was interacting with 3 researchers that are primarily doing research in the field of ergonomics, that they are located in either the Department or School of Business or in Economics. So you look at someone like Emil Tompa, who's in the Department of Economics at the University of Toronto. The other gentleman from the Netherlands, Jan Doel, School of Business, and then a gentleman out of Waterloo who's also just transitioned over to a School of Economics and Business. So there seems to be a little bit of a trend of people recognizing that what we do has an impact on business, and it's also an opportunity for other researchers who may not have the ability to get the funding for massive intervention studies or, I guess, EPI studies to do research on, what's the impact of ergonomics on business performance. It doesn't take a lot of financial, I guess, resources to do that type of analysis. So it's nice to see those types of researchers in business or economics, and I hope that they continue to research the impact of good interventions on the bottom line.
I have another question. Just follow up on Brian Lowe's question regarding the measurements for employee engagement.
Yes.
As a researcher at NIOSH, we've been doing a lot of research measuring so-called psychosocial effects, including job satisfactions. And
yes.
I totally agree with you that most of the studies have shown that the job satisfaction is one of those strongest predictor for the MSD risks, even the injury rate. And so other than that, can you comment on what are the other measurements we can do as far as the employee engagement? Like if you go to see your clients and they're asking you to improve their performance for certain jobs, do you actually get their workers involved? What kind of people would you get involved in terms of designing ergonomic interventions as well as measuring all the risk, stuff like that? Can you have a...
Absolutely. I think when we engage with our clients, we definitely recommend a participatory approach. The employee is a vital part of that job improvement process. They're actively involved in the data collection of the work area to understand what those MSD risks are. We constantly engage with them, asking questions on what do they like, what do they dislike, what do they have challenges with, what would they like to see. Personally, I feel the employee is the world's expert in that job. There's no one else who has more experience, no one else that does that job more than 40 hours per week. And so they are a primary source of knowledge as well as solution. I've always found that sometimes they're a little bit resistant to engaging with us as ergonomists or engineers, not because they are fearful of us. I think they have had experiences in the past where we're not able to follow through. We come up with a great intervention, and then we fail to justify it to leadership to get funding. So the second time I go back and talk to that same employee, they go, well, I spent a lot of time with you, and nothing happened, so why would I spend time with you again? But when we can actually show them that we can follow through, it's amazing what further information they give and how much of a supporter they are for our initiatives. And I always enjoy the situations where you interact with that individual that's really negative, who hasn't had a good experience, and then you solve their problem, and they're your biggest cheerleader. So I think one of the most important parts of ergonomics is engaging with that employee and then solving that problem for them, and then making sure that they help in future interventions. They're a major source of support. Oops. Yep, the right one. So employee engagement is critical. I think that's where I try to spend most of my time. Data collection I can do elsewhere, and I think we've got tools to make data collection go a lot faster, and understanding the risk. The solution's only going to work if the employee actually likes it. That was a long-winded answer to partially interrupted.
Well, that allowed a couple more questions to come through, and we apologize for that. As they mentioned before, we did have some snow and weather here, and I think that was a snowblower that was outside the door that everybody probably heard.
Yeah.
So let's get back. Says, so from your experience, do organizations that have higher rates of MSD injuries typically have lower rates of other serious injuries? So, for example, you'd show that 30% in Canada, or 30% in Canada, or in the U.S. and 50% in Canada. Does that mean that Canada has done a better job of lowering other types of injuries, or an inadequate job of lowering MSDs? Or is it hard to tell?
Great question. I don't have that information off the top of my head. I think it's probably within the error of and just the sample. Basically, if you're going to summarize it, 40% of injuries are MSD related. I'm not too sure if one country is doing a better job than another or focusing on other things. I think it's just that sample. A good portion of non-fatal occupational injuries are MSD related. I think that's the message.
Do you have any recommendations for intervention effectiveness studies?
Absolutely. What was shown here was the Richard Goggins study, probably halfway through, where basically he showed that interventions that focus on engineering solutions that eliminate the condition have the biggest impact, followed by those engineering interventions that focus on reducing the risk have the next biggest. And the ones that have the least amount of impact are the ones that focus on employee behavior and reduce exposure. So I gave a couple examples of those, one being job rotation, and I'm really excited to see there's been some good data coming out of Jack Dennerlein's lab at Harvard and Northeastern, and Sean Gallagher's lab at Auburn, and Jay Capellich's lab in Wisconsin, showing really the ineffectiveness of job rotation as an intervention and almost being a negative. And then you look at, say, interventions that rely upon things like employee behavior, such as lifting techniques. There's a lot of good data from 25 years ago and from recently that show, these have nominal impact. So I think focusing on engineering that address the issue, remembering the hierarchy of controls, those are the interventions that have the biggest impact.
And I think this next question kind of follows into that same thing. I don't know if you'll have anything additional to add. It says, do you know of any methods or tools to use to find leading indicators of ergonomic injury? It seems that most data methods focus on lagging indicators.
Yeah, I mean, risk is the biggest predictor. We have a lot of good MSD risk tools out there. The NIOSH lifting equation, the Snook and Serial tables for push-pull carry, the strain index, the ACGIH TLVs. There's all types of good risk assessment tools out there, some that are expert-based, like the ones I mentioned, and others that are more, workplace or practitioner-friendly or ergo team-friendly. There's a good suite of tools available.
And I think the last question, well, maybe two, but last question is, if I understood right, should we start applying the ergonomics process with the CEO and leaders of industry?
I would highly encourage you to engage those individuals. Help them understand what type of impact and benefit ergonomics can have. Now, it may not be the first person you talk to today, but I think that hopefully we trend towards that. Let's start with engaging them. And I think there's an opportunity there, at least what I'm hearing from directors and VPs of EHS, is that the C-suite is asking those individuals for information to support investor relations, to then provide that information to potential investors. That door is now open. Let's take advantage of it.
That's all we have online.